They called her too old to love, but the quiet rancher who watched her fall would one day ask her to teach him how. The words that broke her heart came beneath the burning noon sun at Dust Creek Station, Wyoming Territory, 1874. Evelyn Hart stepped down from the train in her best blue dress, expecting a new beginning. Instead, a widow in black lace pointed at her before the gathered crowd and declared, "Too old, too late. We don't need a woman past her bloom. You." The whispers spread fast. "Poor thing. Sent back east." Evelyn held her chin high, her hands trembling only when no one watched. She had crossed 2,000 miles chasing the promise of belonging. Now all that waited was humiliation and dust. In the shadow of the freight platform stood Colt Merrin, a rancher with a face carved by loss. He had buried his family 2 winters before, and vowed never to open his door again. Yet as he saw her standing alone, her pride the only thing left unbroken, he felt something in him shift like dry earth catching its first rain. By sundown, the woman cast aside would ride west with the man who feared to feel again, and together they would learn that love, once thought gone to dust, could still rise quietly, like dawn over the empty plains. Dust Creek lay beneath an endless Wyoming sky, a scatter of weather-beaten buildings, a saloon whose sign swung crooked in the wind, and a church whose bell had not rung since the last funeral. The air smelled of sagebrush and iron. Each gust carried dust that settled into every crevice of life, even the heart. Evelyn Hart walked through the quiet Main Street, her boots crunching against the gravel. Her traveling trunk felt heavier now, not from its weight, but from the silence that followed her. She passed men who lowered their eyes, women who whispered behind gloved hands. Each step away from the station felt like peeling off another layer of hope. Behind her, Colt Merrin watched from beside the feed store. His hat shadowed a face marked by sun and solitude. 2 winters ago, fever had taken his wife and son, leaving him with nothing but horses, fences, and an ache too proud to name. Since then, he had lived like a ghost among the living until now. When he caught up to her at the edge of town, she didn't flinch. She simply turned, her voice quiet but firm. "If you've come to pity me, mister, I've had enough of that for a lifetime." Colt shook his head. "Not pity. You need a place to rest. I've got one." For a moment, neither moved. The wind pressed against her dress, carrying away the sounds of Dust Creek behind them. Then, with that calm defiance that only the wounded possess, Evelyn nodded. "Then I'll ride with you, but only until I can stand again." He tipped his hat, almost smiling. "That's all the time I've got to give." And together, they walked into the open prairie, where silence waited like an unspoken prayer. The road westward wound through low hills brushed with gold and shadow. Sage leaves whispered under the hooves of Colt's horse as Evelyn rode behind him, clutching her small valise. Neither spoke for miles. The silence between them wasn't heavy, it was something else, something careful, like 2 hearts learning the weight of quiet company. By the time they reached Colt's ranch, the sun was sinking into a pale red haze. The house stood plain but steady clapboard walls, a porch missing 1 rail, and a barn leaning into the wind like an old soldier. Evelyn dismounted, her legs trembling from the long ride. "This is yours?" she asked softly. Colt nodded. "What's left of it?" Inside, the air smelled of dry wood and thyme. Dust rested on the shelves, and a single photograph hung crooked on the wall, a young woman holding a child, both smiling, both long gone. Evelyn paused before it but said nothing. Colt set down her bag near the door. "You can take the small room. Roof leaks when it rains, but it's clean." She turned to him. "You didn't have to bring me here." He met her gaze, voice low and even. "You didn't have to come." That night, Evelyn lay awake beneath a patchwork quilt, listening to the creak of the boards and the sigh of the wind through the rafters. Somewhere down the hall, a floorboard groaned a reminder that she was not alone, though loneliness still sat close enough to touch. Outside, the moon washed the ranch in silver. Neither of them knew it yet, but this quiet kindness, this fragile mercy, was the spark that would set everything in motion. Morning came pale and cold, the kind that painted frost along the windowsills and made every breath visible. Evelyn woke to the sound of boots on the porch. When she opened her door, a tin cup waited for her warm milk, still steaming. No note, no words, only that small gesture. She found Colt already outside, mending the corral fence. His coat hung heavy on his shoulders, and the sun caught the edge of a scar that trailed beneath his collar. "You didn't have to," she said, lifting the cup. He didn't look up. "Wasn't sure you'd find the stove yet." Days fell into rhythm. Colt worked the land, fixed tools, tended to horses too lean to sell. Evelyn cleaned, patched curtains, and dusted shelves that hadn't known a woman's touch in years. Neither intruded on the other's grief. But in the space between chores, something wordless grew: respect, maybe, or the faint shape of understanding. Each evening, the prairie turned gold and copper. Evelyn would sit on the porch steps, hair undone, eyes fixed on the horizon. Sometimes Colt joined her, saying nothing. Once, she caught him watching her reflection in the lantern glass. He looked away first. One afternoon, while scrubbing linen by the pump, her hand slipped and split along a rusted nail. The blood welled bright against the cold water. Colt said nothing that evening, but the next morning, beside her cup of milk lay a small, carved box. Inside was a spool of thread, a thimble, and a folded note. "For mending what still matters." She stared at it a long time before whispering to no one, "You shouldn't be so kind." Weeks passed. Dust Creek began to murmur. Folks at the mercantile spoke of the stranger woman living out at Merrin Ranch. A widow, they said. Maybe worse. Evelyn heard the whispers and how silence followed her through town when she rode in for supplies. She felt the glances scrape across her skin like wind through thorns. That night, she tried to thank Colt for the ride, to tell him she would leave come morning. But when she stepped into the doorway, she found him sitting by the hearth, his hand resting on a wooden frame. "She was my wife," he said before she could speak. "And that was my boy." His thumb brushed the glass once. Fever took them fast. Evelyn stood quietly, her voice barely above the crackle of the fire. "I'm sorry." Colt nodded, eyes fixed on the embers. "You don't have to be. They were the only good I had. I just never figured what to do when the good runs out." That. Evelyn wanted to reach for him but didn't. She only said, "You keep living, even when it doesn't ask you to." He looked up then, and for the first time, he really saw her not as a burden, not as a stranger, but as a woman standing in the same ruins he lived in. The next morning, a letter arrived by post from the woman who had humiliated her at the station, Mrs. Barlow. The handwriting was sharp, like a blade. "Dust Creek talks, Miss Hart. Decency requires distance. Leave before shame finds you." Evelyn folded the letter and slid it into the fire. The paper curled black, the ink turning to smoke. Colt watched from the doorway. "You care too much what people think," he said. "And you care too little," she answered. He smiled faintly. "Maybe somewhere between us is the right amount." But the gossip spread. A week later, a polished carriage rolled up to the ranch. Mrs. Millie Davenport, the widow of a local judge, all perfume and pearls, arrived with a sweet smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I heard such troubling things," she said, surveying the place. "I thought I'd offer a bit of help. You poor, dear woman all alone out here with Mr. Merrin." Evelyn kept her tone even. "I'm hardly helpless, Mrs. Davenport." "What?" Millie's gaze drifted to Colt, who stood a few feet away, hands in pockets, eyes unreadable. "Perhaps not," she said smoothly. "Still, a woman's reputation is fragile. Dust Creek can be unkind." When she left, Evelyn stood in the yard a long time, the wind tugging her shawl. "She wants you," she said at last. Colt spat into the dirt. "She wants the land. That's all she's ever wanted." "Then I'll make it easy for her," Evelyn said quietly. "I'll go." He turned, startled. "You don't have to." "Yes," she said. "I do." That night, she packed her things, her books, her worn shawl, the little carved box. She moved slowly, as if each fold of cloth was a goodbye. Before dawn, she set the milk cup on the table, washed and empty. When Colt found her room bare, the silence that filled the house was heavier than loss. He stood there a long time, the old habit of grief returning like an unwelcome guest. But by mid-morning, the wind shifted. He smelled it before he saw it smoke, sharp and bitter, curling from the barn. Damn it! He ran out barefoot, shirt half buttoned, the fire already roaring through the dry hay. Horses screamed in panic. He tore open the stall doors, dragging the first two out, coughing hard. A beam crashed beside him, sparks biting at his arm. He pushed through the smoke toward the last stall, the old bay gelding too stubborn to move. When the beam above him gave way, it pinned his shoulder against the wall. Pain blinded him. He tried to push up, but the weight was too much. He thought of nothing, not the land, not the horses, only the echo of her voice. "You shouldn't be so kind." Miles away, Evelyn was walking the ridge road toward the stage route when she saw the column of smoke. Her breath caught. Dust Creek lay behind her. She could keep walking, but she didn't. She dropped her trunk and ran. The closer she came, the thicker the smoke. By the time she reached the ranch, the barn was half swallowed by flame. "Colt!" she shouted, voice raw. A faint cough answered. She covered her mouth with her shawl, pushed through the heat. Inside, the air clawed at her lungs. She found him near the back, half buried under a fallen beam. "You fool," she gasped. "You absolute fool." "Evelyn," his voice cracked. "You came back. Don't talk." She wedged a broken post beneath the beam, levered it up with every ounce of strength she had. "If you die here, I'll never forgive you." When the beam shifted, she pulled him free, dragging him out into the open air just as the roof caved in behind them. The world was nothing but light and smoke and breath. She fell beside him, coughing, her sleeve singed. He turned his head toward her, weak smile breaking through the soot. "I told you I had a place," he whispered. "Didn't mean it should burn." Evelyn laughed through her tears, voice trembling. "And I told you I wouldn't stay. Guess we're both liars now." He reached for her hand, rough and shaking. "Then maybe it's time we both start telling the truth." She held his hand tighter. "You first." He closed his eyes, breath shallow. "I don't want the quiet anymore, not if you're not in it." When dawn broke, the barn was gone, reduced to blackened ribs against a pale sky. The air smelled of ash and wet soil. Evelyn sat by his bedside, bandaging his shoulder. The faintest smile touched his lips when he woke. "Still here?" he rasped. She dipped a cloth in cool water. "For now." He studied her face, soot-streaked, eyes red but steady. "You saved me." She shook her head gently. "No, you saved me first. Back at that station, you just didn't know it." For a long time, neither spoke. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the wind carried the sound of horses, the few that had survived. "At last," she said, "they called me too old to love." Colt's voice was rough, but certain. "Then they've never seen how you look when you fight the fire." That evening, the wind turned warm again. She stood on the porch, watching the last embers die in the distance. Colt joined her, his arm bound in linen. "Dust Creek will talk," she said quietly. "They always do," he replied. "But let them talk about this, about the woman who ran into fire, not away from it." She turned to him, a faint smile breaking through. "And the man who stopped running from everything else." He nodded once. "Maybe that's how it starts." That night, for the first time, she didn't close her door. By the time Colt Merrin could stand again, the barn was only a memory, a skeleton of beams against the sky. He worked slower now, his left arm bound and stiff, but he refused to stop. Evelyn stayed through it all, patching what could be salvaged, tending the animals that had survived. The house smelled of smoke and herbs, and something else, something new belonging. Yet Dust Creek never forgot how to whisper. At the general store, women pretended not to stare when Evelyn passed. "Living under a man's roof? No preacher's blessing?" they said. Shameful. She ignored them, her face calm, though her hands shook when she reached for her change. That evening, she rode home alone beneath a sky bleeding orange and violet. The prairie wind carried the faint sound of the church bell calling for evening prayer. For everyone but her. When she reached the ranch, Colt was waiting by the porch rail, hat in hand. "You shouldn't ride alone," he said. "I'm used to it," she replied, dismounting. "You can't fix what people choose to believe." He studied her, his gaze steady but uncertain. "I can stand beside you, though." She looked up at him, her voice quiet but fierce. "Then do it where it matters." 3 days later, Millie Davenport came again. This time dressed for triumph. Black silk, gold earrings, the smile of a woman who thought she'd won. "My dear," she said to Evelyn, stepping down from her carriage, "you've caused quite the stir. You must understand, a woman's reputation is like lace once torn, it never mends. It would be kinder to leave before Mr. Merrin's name burns with yours." Evelyn's fingers tightened on the porch rail. "Thank you for the advice," she said coolly. "But I don't take orders from envy." Millie's smile hardened. "We'll see how long kindness lasts when the town stops buying his grain and horses. Dust Creek favors respectability, Mrs. Hart, even when it's wrong." When she left, Colt stood in the doorway, jaw tight. "She's right about one thing," he said quietly. "This town eats what it fears." Evelyn looked at him, weary but unbroken. "Then let them choke." That night, she wrote a letter. Not to anyone, just to the version of herself who had stepped off the train months ago. She wrote of the fire, of the milk cups, of quiet mornings when the world felt almost gentle again. She folded it, sealed it, and left it on the table. Then she packed her things. At dawn, she stood by the window, the first light spilling through thin curtains. "Colt," she whispered. He turned from the stove. "I can't stay where I'm someone's scandal," she said. "Not yours, not mine." He crossed the floor slowly. "And if I asked you to?" She smiled sadly. "Then I'd be the woman they said I was waiting for permission to live." She reached for his hand, pressed it once, and walked out the door. The train station looked different this time, brighter, crueler. Families gathered, laughter sharp as broken glass. Evelyn bought her ticket without meeting anyone's eyes. She stood near the platform's edge, her shawl drawn tight, the wind tossing stray strands of hair across her face. The whistle of the approaching train sounded like an ending. And then, a murmur behind her. Heads turning. Voices softening. Colt Merrin was walking down the main street toward the station, one arm still in a sling, his coat unbuttoned, his boots leaving prints in the dust. He walked through the crowd as if he didn't hear them, as if the noise of the world had gone still. When he reached her, he stopped only a few feet away. "Evelyn Hart," he said, his voice rough but clear enough to carry. "When you came here, they said you were too old to love, too used up for hope. They laughed when I let you stay." Low. The crowd shifted uneasily. They didn't see the woman who ran into fire. The woman who saved my life when I'd stopped thinking it mattered. The woman who brought peace to a house that hadn't known it in years. He took a breath. "So hear me now, Dust Creek. If she's too old to love, then I am too foolish to let her go." Evelyn's breath caught. The air around them seemed to hold still, even the train whistle fading into distance. Colt stepped closer, his voice soft now, meant only for her. "I don't want you to go, not because I need saving, but because I finally found something worth keeping." Her eyes glistened. "And what would that be?" He smiled, small and unsteady. "You." The silence broke not with laughter or gossip, but with a slow, hesitant clap from somewhere in the crowd. Then another, and another. Evelyn's throat tightened. Her valise slipped from her hand, landing with a soft thud. She stepped forward. Colt reached for her hand, rough fingers brushing hers gently, reverently. "You sure?" she whispered. He nodded once. "I've never been sure of much, but this I could stake my land on it." For a long heartbeat, neither moved. Then she let out the breath she'd been holding since the day she first arrived and said simply, "Then we build something new." The crowd parted as they walked away together, leaving the train behind. The sun caught in her hair, and for the first time, the people of Dust Creek didn't whisper. They watched in quiet awe. Days turned to weeks. Gossip dulled into acceptance. The Merrin ranch rose again, slower this time, steadier. Evelyn painted the shutters pale green, the color of forgiveness. Colt built new fences, new stalls, each plank a promise made without words. One morning, as the air turned warm with spring, Evelyn found something waiting on the porch, a small wooden box carved with the same pattern as before. Inside was a simple ring, forged from a melted horseshoe, dark and imperfect. She turned to find Colt behind her, wiping his hands on a rag. "I'm not much for speeches," he said, "but I figure what's made of fire tends to last." Evelyn's eyes filled. "Are you asking me?" He nodded. "Not because you need it, because I do. I don't want a house full of ghosts anymore. I want it full of you." Tears caught in the corners of her smile. "Then yes, but you'll have to put up with me correcting your grammar for the rest of your life." "No." He laughed softly, the first true laugh she'd ever heard from him, and slipped the ring onto her hand. "Reckon I can live with that." The wedding was small. No grand gowns, no choir. Just wine through the grass, a preacher borrowed from the next town, and a few children tossing wildflowers from a tin pail. Evelyn wore a dress she'd sewn herself. Colt wore his best shirt, missing one button but freshly pressed. When the vows were said, he leaned close and whispered, "Still think you're too old to love?" She smiled through her tears. "No, I think I just had to find the right fool." Oh, one. And as the wind swept over the plains, carrying laughter into the open sky, Dust Creek found something it hadn't had in years: silence, not from shame, but from reverence. That night, when the house settled into quiet, Evelyn stood at the window, the silver of her ring glinting in the lamplight. The prairie stretched before her, vast, eternal. Behind her, Colt strummed a few slow notes on an old guitar, the melody soft and unsure. She turned toward him, voice gentle. "Play it again, the song you don't finish." He looked up, smiling. "It's not done." "Neither are we," she said. And under the Wyoming moon, they began again, not with fire, nor promise, but with the quiet certainty that love, once kindled, could outlast even the dust. Spring came early that year, soft and golden, the kind that coaxed life from the ground as if the earth itself had been waiting for permission. The Merrin ranch, once a place of smoke and silence, now hummed with quiet purpose. Chickens pecked near the fence line, horses grazed in the meadow beyond, and laughter, gentle, tentative laughter, could sometimes be heard from the porch. Evelyn moved through the house like she belonged there. The curtains she'd sewn fluttered in the morning wind. The shelves, once empty, now held books and jars of dried herbs. Every corner bore her touch, not decoration, but care. Colt often watched her without saying a word, as though memorizing the sight of something he'd never believed he'd have again. One evening, as the sky blazed orange over the plains, Evelyn sat by the window, mending a shirt. Her belly, round beneath her apron, rose with the rhythm of her breathing. Colt leaned against the doorframe, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You should rest," he said softly. "I am," she replied, not looking up. "Just quietly." He stepped closer, crouched beside her, his rough hand resting gently on hers. "Does it scare you?" Evelyn met his gaze. "Everything worth having does." The child came with the first rain of May, a girl, small but fierce, with a cry that shook the rafters. Evelyn wept when she held her, her tears falling onto the baby's soft hair. Colt stood beside her, awestruck, his large hands trembling as he reached out. "She's perfect," he whispered. Evelyn smiled through exhaustion. "Then we name her Grace, because that's what she is." In the months that followed, the ranch became more than land, it became home. Evelyn taught children from neighboring farms to read on the front porch while Colt worked the fences nearby. Sometimes, he would pause just to listen to the sound of her voice and the laughter of the little ones echoing across the yard. At sunset, they would walk together to the hill behind the barn, Grace bundled in her arms. From there, the world stretched endless, the prairie glowing under the last light, the wind whispering through the grass. "Remember the day we met?" she asked once. "How could I forget?" Colt chuckled. "You looked like you were ready to shoot the first man who spoke." "I almost did," she teased, nudging him. "But then you offered me quiet instead of pity. No one had ever done that before." He looked at her, eyes warm. "You gave me back a life I didn't know how to live." "One." Evelyn rested her head against his shoulder. "We both found what we weren't looking for." Years later, the townsfolk stopped whispering when they passed. Dust Creek had learned to tell their story differently. The schoolhouse Evelyn built drew children from miles around. The ranch became a place people pointed to when they spoke of endurance, of decency, of love that didn't fade. Millie Davenport came once more, older now, her pride dulled by time. She stood by the fence, watching Evelyn teach a group of children to read beneath the cottonwoods. When Evelyn noticed her and waved, Millie hesitated, then nodded in return, a small, wordless surrender. One quiet evening, Colt sat by the hearth, the guitar across his knees. Grace, now toddling, giggled as Evelyn tried to braid her hair. The melody Colt played was simple, unpolished, the same tune he had strummed the night. Evelyn told him they were not done yet. When the song ended, Evelyn crossed the room and kissed the top of his head. "You finally finished it," she said. He looked up at her with a soft grin. Not quite. Some songs don't end. They just keep changing with the seasons. 1. She smiled, pressing her hand to his cheek. Then, let's keep playing. Outside, the wind moved through the fields, stirring the tall grass into waves of gold. The house glowed from within a small light against a vast and restless land. Once, Dust Creek had called Evelyn Hart, too old to love. Now, they called her the woman who stayed. And in the quiet warmth of that home, with her husband's laughter, her daughter's soft breathing, and the endless hum of the prairie around them, Evelyn understood what she had always searched for. Not rescue, not forgiveness, but a place to belong, and a man who had chosen to stand beside her, again and again. And that, she knew, was love enough to last a lifetime. Years slipped by like wind over the prairie, gentle, unhurried, carrying the scent of rain and wood smoke. The Merrin ranch stood strong against every season that tried to break it. Its fences grayed, its barn aged, but laughter still echoed from the porch each evening when the sun dipped behind the ridge. Evelyn's hair silvered early, touched by the same light that gilded the wheat fields. Colt's gait grew slower, his shoulders more stooped, yet when he walked beside her, the years between them seemed to vanish. Time had not made them weaker. It had made them sure. Grace grew tall, her mother's quiet strength and her father's stubborn smile mingling into something fierce and beautiful. She rode her first horse at 8, built her first fence by 12, and swore she'd never leave the land that raised her. Evelyn would smile and say, "Then remember, my darling, home isn't the ground beneath you, but the hearts beside you." One evening, when the sky burned gold and rose, Colt stood by the paddock watching Grace teach a colt to follow her hand. Evelyn joined him, a shawl around her shoulders. For a while, neither spoke. Then Colt murmured, "When I buried the old life, I thought the best of me went with it." He looked at her, eyes soft as dusk. "But you were the part I hadn't met yet." Evelyn's hand found his. "And you," she said, voice trembling, "were the silence that waited for me to speak." Dad. The wind carried their words across the field, nothing grand, nothing loud, just two truths meeting in the open air. Years later, when Dust Creek told their story, they didn't start with the humiliation at the train station, nor with the fire that nearly took them both. They began with the moment she stayed, the moment love stopped being something young and became something enduring. And if you pass by their ranch on a quiet Wyoming morning, you might still see it. An old guitar hanging by the porch, a weathered cup left on the rail, and two rocking chairs side by side, worn smooth by years of simple, steadfast love. Because in the wide, untamed heart of the West, not all fires burn to destroy. Some are meant to begin again.